Okay, in this video we're going to look at making a double exposure in Photoshop, and we're going to start off in pretending to put off that actual double exposure into a vinyl album cover size. So that's a 12.375 square. So we're going to play around with that, but strictly in Photoshop. We're even going to lay some text down in Photoshop. So let's start right away. I've already set it up here at 12.375 by 12.375 inches. Now, if I converted that, say, to pixels right away, it would convert it for me automatically, but obviously I don't want that in pixels. This is going to be for print. I want it in inches. And I'm not going to set up a bleed for any of this at all. Normally I would, obviously, and then I'd bring it into Illustrator or InDesign. But for now, I just want to play around in Photoshop and see what kind of concept I can come up with. 300 pixels per inch resolution, not pixels per centimeter. Make sure it's pixels per inch. And the color mode, normally, yes, it's print, and I would normally do it in CMYK. However, we want to keep it in RGB for now. RGB gives us more access to all the Photoshop features, where CMYK actually limits the amount of features we have to use in Photoshop. So we want to keep it like this. So this is everything I want, and I'm good to go. I'm going to create, and there's my square, there's my canvas, and my workspace around it. So now what I need to do is I need to bring in some images. Double exposure consists of obviously two images over top of each other, kind of almost like composited in a certain way, superimposed on top of each other, but in a very controlled manner. And there are certain styles that are usually you'll see with double exposure, which I'm going to play around with a little bit. But you could also put in like a triple exposure, or even more. You could always put in more photos too once you have the basics set up. So let's do that right now. I'm going to show you a couple different ways. I have my organized file already of my resources, which, you know what, I'm going to name this one resources anyways. So to have a structured file and folders all set up is a great idea. So the first thing I'm going to bring in is my portrait. Now there's a few different ways to open up image into Photoshop. Number one, the way I like to do it, I am on a Mac, so I'm just going to click and drag and bring an image over top of the Photoshop icon, and it's going to open up in its own tab. Perfect. Another way to do it, file, open, and I'm going to just search my computer in my Finder, same idea, resources and portrait, and there I go, open. And that's exactly what I want, which is great. Now, there is another way to do it, but something might happen if you do it this way. Let me show you. I'm going to actually go right onto my canvas and import it, which I don't want you to do it this way. But if you actually import an image directly onto a canvas that's already existing, already open, watch what happens. I open it up, and I know that my image is actually bigger than this canvas, this 12 by 12. But what Photoshop does for me is it kind of sizes my picture to the constraints of this canvas already, which I don't necessarily want. So I'm actually already losing these particular pixels and the quality of it if I were to shrink it down. And that's okay for quickness or anything like that. But if I wanted the full resolution of my image, the full pixel density, I'd want to open it up in its own document. And the other thing that happens here too, if I press enter to set it, I'm going to open it up. It's going to open up as a smart object. The smart object up here, I actually want it to open up as a pixel layer. So it's already rasterized. It's not a smart object. Now, do not get me wrong. Smart objects are awesome. They're great to work with. I have another video for smart objects. But this right now, I don't want it to be a smart object. But if that accidentally happens, the way to change it back into a raster file, or a pixel layer we should say, I could right click and just click on a rasterized layer, and now all of a sudden it's back to being a pixel layer. Okay, so either way, I'm not going to do it this way anyway, so I'm just going to delete that. So I have my portrait, here it is, very unflattering, but I'm going to bring it in, and the way to bring it in, I'm just going to click and drag it, hover over top of the document I want it to be in, and place it on my canvas and let go of the click. And there it is. Now see how that's the full resolution of my image. Okay, that's how it should be properly done. Now I'm going to also bring in my landscape. I'm going to choose a landscape here. I have a few to work with, but I'm going to bring this one in. And once again, I'm just going to click and drag, bring it over top of Photoshop, and that opens up in its new tab. And another way to bring an image in to a canvas that's already open in a document, I could just turn off the lock layer. Anytime you open up an image, it's its own individual layer. It's going to Photoshop's going to lock it automatically. That's all you have to do is click, and it disappears the lock, and now you can access anything you want to do with this. So the other way to do it, instead of just clicking and dragging and bring it over, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just copy this layer. So edit, copy, which is Command C on a PC, Control C. So I'm going to copy it, Command C, and I'm going to place it onto this artboard or this canvas, which is what I'm working on, Command V, and there it is. It copied the layer in. Now it's a little bit smaller than and that's okay. I'm not too concerned about that because I'm going to play around with it a little bit later. Now the one thing in Photoshop, you do have to realize and remember it is a raster program, and normally with raster graphics, we don't want to size them up, we don't want to scale them up, we want to always scale them down. If you start scaling raster graphics up higher, Photoshop tries to interpolate the pixels and they get blurry and pixelated if you go too high. If you just scale them up a little bit, and depending on the end result, what you're looking for, it might be okay, but normally we want to scale down. So what I'm going to do right away is I'm going to label these properly. Always organize yourself, which is very important, and labeling will definitely help you out. So what I want is I'm going to bring my landscape underneath my portrait. I want to work with my portrait first, and I want it to be on top. So I'm just going to click and drag. So I can click and drag them above or below. You can see that little blue line shows me where it's about to go, but I just want my portrait on top and I'm good to go. Now with the portrait currently, maybe it's a little too big. Maybe I want it to be a little bit smaller. Well, how do I do that? Very easily. So it's going to be edit and free transform. So Command T or Control T on a PC. So Command T I'm going to press, and a bounding box shows up around the whole image. So that's all I'm going to do is drag from the corners. Now when I drag from the corners, normally in other programs and you drag, you hold down shift to keep it in proportion. But in Photoshop, the settings are that you don't have to hold down shift. Shift will actually keep it out of proportion, which we definitely don't want. Now there are different settings which you could set it, say, no, I want to hold down shift to keep it in proportion. You could set those in your preferences if you'd like, but for now, I'm going to leave it as is. As long as it's in proportion, it doesn't matter. So I'm just going to play around and say, okay, how do I want this to look? How do I want this to feel? I'm going to maybe bring it down a little bit here, because when you do look at some double exposures, you notice a lot of negative space around the image, around the double exposure, so it can really play around with that negative space and really put focus on the foreground. So right about there is fine, and I'm happy with that. And if it gets cut off, that's okay, because we're actually going to get rid of the background anyways. That's part of it, really having that negative space in the background. So I'm just going to press enter, or to release the free transform and set it, I could just click anywhere else or click on something else and it'll set it automatically. So there I go. I'm kind of happy with that. Looks good, not a problem. Now what I want to do is I want to show you something about auto select here. So when I have my move tool selected, normally by default auto select is on. Auto select is just a quick way to select something on your artboard. So if I'm here, I'm on my artboard, I click on this, it's selected. If I click on my landscape, you see now all of a sudden it's clicked and it's selected. That's cool, that's fine. However, when we're playing with double exposures, we're playing with different masks, we're playing with different opacities. Photoshop doesn't always know exactly what we actually want to select. So I actually never have auto select on at all. I do it the way I want to do it manually. So in order to select something, obviously now I could just select something by the layer and it moves, and if I click on landscape, it doesn't actually click because it's not on auto select. But what I like to do instead is command click or control click on a PC. I hold down command and watch what happens. It automatically shows that auto select is on. I move whatever I want on. I command click and now this is selected. Command click and this is selected. I feel it gives me more control over what I want to click and select than if auto select was automatically on. And you might find that issue when you start playing around with the masks and opacity. So for me, always shut this off and use command click to select things, or use the layer to select what you want and then move it around. I'm a big fan of that. Next, what we're going to do, we're going to line everything up. I'm going to shut off my landscape for now, because now what I want to do, I want to select my object and I want to remove the background. But there is a cool tool here that actually Photoshop has, which is I select my portrait layer, and in my properties panel, if you don't have that open, go to Windows and Properties. And at the bottom here it says remove background or select subject. Let's see how this works. Now, depending on your image, it might work really well or it might work very poorly, which I'm going to show you how to do it manually. Right now, the image I took actually has a very flat, simple background, which is going to be easy for Photoshop to recognize the hard edges. Potentially the hair might give me some issue, and it's going to help me understand where the foreground is and background is. Let's give it a shot and see what happens. I'm going to click select subject, and let's see what Photoshop does. Great job here, really good with the hair, a little issue here, but generally did a really good job. Now let's do the opposite. Command D to deselect, so deselect there. And I'm just going to try to do the opposite. I'm going to do remove background. Let's see what it does. Once again, really good job. A little bit of an issue there, but that's okay, because look what happened. As soon as I did remove background, Photoshop added a mask for me, and that's what a mask is. It still appears on the same layer. It's either going to be black or white, or all black or all white. So what we need to know about masks, which I'm going to explain a little bit later, is that white is something that is shown or revealed, and black is something that's hidden. So all my pixels are still there, but they're just masked out. They're just hidden. Now I'm going to undo that, because I'm going to do this in a manual way to show you how to do this, especially if you have a tricky background. So I'm just going to undo that. So to do this manually, the way I like to do it, I like to use the quick selection tool, quick selection. And what it does, I get to paint on the selection. I get to brush on the selection. Now, if I were to use my brush panel, what I would do here, I would go to my brush, and it would be, you don't have to worry about hardness or anything like that because it's just a selection tool, a selection brush. So what I would do is I just click and it selects an area for me. So what I can do now is I can actually just paint on my selection like this. Now, if I want to make my brush a little bit smaller, I can go up to the brush panel here and make the size smaller of my brush. Or what I like to use is my keyboard shortcut, open bracket and close bracket. Open bracket makes it smaller, close bracket makes it bigger. So I'm making my brush a little bit bigger now. Little by little. And now I can start painting. But once again, if I want more detail, make it a little bit smaller. And as I start to brush, I start to find that edge. All right, there I am. There I am. Looks good. A little bit of an issue here, not a problem. Fix it up. Oh, didn't get my ear. Let me get that. Oh, want to get a little bit of that hair at the top. Very good. Oh, let me see if I can get this little piece here. Fantastic. Now that looks good. My ear. Oh, I went over a little bit. That's okay. What I can do now, because I went over, my selection wasn't exactly what I wanted. I could actually do the opposite here. Up here on my control panel, it has the minus. So I could actually subtract part of that selection. Or I could hold down Option or Alt on a PC. And if I press on Option, I'm actually now removing some of that selection. So there's another way to do it. And if I accidentally go over and select too much, once again, hold down Option, click and drag, and it'll bring it back to its closest edge. And that looks pretty good right there. And once again, this does not have to be perfect because we're going to do something next that's going to help us make an even better selection. And then even further, we can play around with the mask anytime we want. So now that I have a decent selection around my subject, once again, does not have to be perfect, I'm going to press on my control panel, select and mask. And now what's going to happen, it opens up its own panel just for selecting and masking, which I can always get out of anytime I want to go back or say, yes, I'm good to go. So what I'd like to do first, and when I look at my view mode, I like to look at overlay. Overlay gives me a flat colored background, anything I want, which gives me an idea of like, where am I missing? Where could I add? What could I subtract? So I have overlay on. You could change up any color you want. Doesn't really matter. Change up the opacity of that particular color. And once again, if you have other layers on below, it's going to show those layers below, but I happen to shut off my landscape. What I like to do first is I could zoom in a little bit, Command plus, use my hand tool, which is the space bar, and move it around. So click on space bar, it turns into a hand tool. I see that there's a bit of an issue here, a little up here, but once again, it doesn't really matter because we could fix it later a bit there, but I'm going to try to refine it here. So the first thing I like to do, play around with, is turn on Smart Radius. Now Smart Radius, normally if you have hard edges, like how the neck is nice and hard there, it's a straight edge, that's Photoshop recognizes them very, very well. When it comes to fuzzier edges like fur or hair, then we have to start saying, hey, Photoshop, can you help me out here? Can you try to get that hair a little bit better? So we turn on Smart Radius and we start to see what Photoshop can do for us if I play around with that. So it's trying to find my areas a little bit more, trying to define my edges a little bit more, and it did a pretty good job there, but it also loses some of it. There's some red in there, there's a little bit more here, it's kind of getting away from the ear. That's okay, because we're going to play around with that. The next thing I could work with and look at is smoothness, and I could bring this up a little bit and start to look at the areas here and, you know, how's it working, and yeah, not too great. So your image might do better with feather and smooth and contrast and shift edge, but what I'm going to do right now is look at my manual tools here on the left. The second one is Refine Edge Brush tool, and that's all I have to do is just help Photoshop out a little bit more and say, listen, you had a bit of an issue here. I want to refine this certain areas here. So let me just click and drag and see how Photoshop fixes this area for me. So it fixed it a little bit, but it also brought some back in. That's okay. What I can do now is actually do the opposite. I'm actually going to say, no, I want you to bring that back. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt on a PC, and I'm just going to click and drag and say, no, I really want that selection actually to be there. I want that to be a part of the revealed part of the mask, and it brings it right back. Same up here. I'm going to click and drag. Looks good, but it brought in some of that background. It's not recognized as foreground. That's okay. I'm going to hold on Option. I'm going to click and drag and bring that part back. But once again, does not have to be perfect, because what I'm going to end up doing is obviously playing with my mask later. I'm going to click and drag here. Did a pretty good job, but once again, hold on Option to bring back my ear, maybe some of these spots here too. Great. Bit of an issue here. I'm just going to hold on Option, bring that back. just going to click and drag and see if Photoshop recognizes this. Yep, it cleaned it up much better. See if it happens here, do the same thing. No, it's still a problem, so I'm going to go like that, and that's totally fine. And like that. Once again, does not have to be perfect. I just want to show you. So I'm happy with all that. Looks pretty good. I'm going to try. Sometimes decontaminate colors works. Sometimes it doesn't. Oh, that seemed to help it a little bit more. Give it a little bit better mask. So I'm just going to say good. I'm happy with that. So what I'm going to do now, I want to output it. So what I'd like is output new layer with layer mask. I'm a big fan of non-destructive ways to play with things. So I make a new layer, and this new mask that I just made is going to be on that layer. So instead of working on certain layers, I duplicate layers, which is a non-destructive way. I'm just going to say new layer with layer mask. Great. Okay. And look what happens. I have my new layer. I duplicated this new layer, and it has a mask on it, which is great. So I'm just going to throw this one away a little bit. I'm just going to put it underneath. I don't need it right now. If I ever need to use this one again, I can always go back to it. It's always there. I don't have to open it back up again and reposition it. It's there. Don't touch it. Leave it alone. Now what I want to do, because I'm going to start playing around with this mask a little bit, I want to just duplicate it so I can always have this mask intact even if I start playing around with it. So I'm just going to duplicate this layer. A few different ways to do that. Keyboard Command J, duplicates it. Okay, I could hold down Option or Alt and click and drag, duplicates it. Great. I can click and drag over top of the plus sign, it duplicates it. Awesome. And then I could also drop down and just say duplicate layer. There we go. I have a few options there, and I duplicate it. Great. So I have portrait 2, portrait copy 2. You name them whatever you want, but this is totally fine as long as we know which portrait we're working with, and that's great. So I'm going to, once again, I'm going to shut that one off. I'm going to bring it underneath because these two I could work with later if I ever need them, but I do want to keep this mask intact. Now let's talk about masks just a little bit right now, just so we fully understand them. With masks, once again, on the one layer, what do I have? I have the actual image, the actual pixels. I have a little link or a little chain that connects them two together. And I have the actual mask, the black and white area. I have the name, and then obviously the open space. Open space, if I double click, brings up layer styles, but that's another video. So I'm on the mask. Look what happens when I'm on the mask. It shows a selection around it, a little border. If I click on the picture, now I'm on the picture. So make sure that you have the proper spot selected. The mask is either going to be worked on or the picture is going to be worked on, okay? Right now we want to work on the mask. I want to show you how the mask works. I click on the brush tool, and we just look at our foreground and background colors, mainly the foreground. What's on right now? The white is showing. So with mask selected, when I paint on white, what happens is it reveals, it shows pixels. So if I start clicking, let me put it to 100% so we can see better. If I start clicking, look what happens. It brings back what I originally had. Okay, great. Now that's painted white. Now I'm going to undo that. Now the opposite happens if I paint on black. I'm going to paint black. Look what happens. It shows, it hides pixels. Okay. So that's what happens. I paint white and it shows. All right. I paint black and it hides. Now a quick way to switch these two is just to press X. So I press X and it just changes them up for me. Okay. So I'm hiding or I'm revealing. Okay. That's how the mask works. Now really quickly, if I were to actually click on my actual pixel layer and paint, and let's pretend I paint black. If I did this accidentally, I'm just painting black over top of this image. Look what happened. I'm not painting on the mask. I just actually painted black right over top of my pixels. That's a huge problem. So make sure you're painting black or white on your mask if you're trying to mask something out. If you're trying to paint on the image, by all means, make sure it's clicked, but I'm sure you don't want to do that at the moment. The other thing I quickly want to show you about masks as well is how to put on your own manual mask without having to do that quick selection and select and mask. The mask tool's right down here. If I just want to add a blank mask right away, I just add layer mask. Done. There's my layer mask. Now look, it's all white. That means everything is showing. So if I want to get rid of some things manually, I click on the black foreground and then I just start painting. And there we go. It's hiding those areas. Okay. And now look, it shows. That's the part I painted. I'm going to undo that. And once again, if I want to, if I painted that, I was like, oh no, I want to bring it back, I could paint white and bring it all back. Okay. Now, the other way to do this too is an interesting way. If I knew that I wanted to actually hide everything and only bring some parts back, then instead of having it all white, what I would do is Command I or Control I, and it inverts the mask. So now the whole thing is hidden. So if I want to show some, what I would do is maybe kind of remember where the eyes were. Oh, there it is there. And paint just back the eyes, whatever I want to do. Play around with my brush tool, make it smaller, bigger, however that is. So that's how a mask works. Just a quick understanding of the mask. But you know what, say, I don't like this mask. I want to get rid of it. I'm just going to click and drag it out. And Photoshop says, do you want to apply the mask and keep it as is and destroy those pixels? Or do you just want to delete the mask? I said I want to delete it. And quite frankly, I just want not this to show up anymore, and I'll delete it. So I'm going to shut that off. Back to this. That's how a mask works. Okay, so now that we have that, what I could actually do is start to play around with this mask. But with that, I'm going to do one thing first, because then we're almost done actually doing what we want to do. The double exposure is almost done actually. And I know I've talked a lot about other options, but really to get to the part of the double exposure, we're kind of almost there. What I want to do next is to actually take this mask and duplicate it and put it on the landscape layer. So that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to take this mask, I'm going to hold down Option on my keyboard or Alt on a PC, and I'm going to click and drag, and look, that layer highlights blue, and now that mask is on top, is actually a part of the landscape layer. If I turn the landscape layer on and I shut my portrait layer off, look, the mask is there and it's inside. My landscape is inside that mask. Remember, the parts that are hidden and parts that are shown. The white area is what is shown. The black area is what's hidden. Those pixels are still there. Non-destructive way. I did not delete any pixels. They are still there. But what I can do now is play around with the positioning of that landscape. So I know that the landscape, doesn't look great, and maybe I want a certain part of it to show. So what I'll do is I'll move the landscape around. But watch what happens when I move the landscape around. I'm going to click and drag. It's like, oh, that's not what I wanted. I don't want that to happen. I'm going to undo that. I just want to move the landscape pixel layer around. I don't want to move the mask around. Well, that's where this little chain link comes in. So I'm going to click off of that. So now they're not linked together. The mask is going to stay stationary, but the actual picture that I have selected is going to move. And there I go. I'm moving it. And once again, maybe I want to size it up just a little bit because I want it to cover more area. So I'm going to click on Command T, free transform, edit free transform, and just make it a little bit bigger. And I'm quite happy with that. That looks good. Now, once again, nothing has to be perfect yet, because once we start playing around with the masks, I might delete some of these areas. I might hide some of these areas. So I'm just going to leave it alone as is, press enter, release the free transform, and now I'm happy with that. I'm going to click that link back on, or you don't have to, it doesn't matter. You can do that as well. Okay, now that I have that done, I'm kind of there. Now, I'm going to do it in a certain way where I'm going to give you far more control. You're going to play around. You have a lot more things to add to this. However, that's all I have to do now is on my portrait layer, I'm actually going to go through my blending modes. And the blending modes are going to help me blend this layer into the layers below it. Now, these are the only two layers that are active. I could actually shut this one off, but I won't because I'm going to change that up later. But it doesn't really interfere with it. I'm just going to click on my blending modes here, and I'm just going to hover over them and see what starts to happen, how these two blend together. So I'm just going to hover over and see what happens. You're going to find some interesting effects, some that work better than others. Now, some people, when they do double exposure, they just do this and they're happy with it. They're content with the way certain ones look, because some of them are pretty cool, aesthetically very pleasing, and some are just a little bit too much. And the great thing about it too, once you pick one you kind of like it, you could play around with it in terms of its mask and whatever you want. But realistically, I just want to show you what you can do here. And another way to scroll through these is with your move tool selected. If I hold down Shift plus or minus, it will also hover through them, or actually go through all the individual blending modes, just like as if hovering over. Okay, so there's another option there. Hold down Shift plus or minus as long as your move tool is selected. But once again, I just like hovering over because I can see it pretty good. And that's great. So I'm going to go back to normal though, because I want to control it myself. I want to see what I can do here myself, and I'm going to play around. So I'm going to click on the mask, and now I'm going to start taking away, hiding some of my portrait pixels so I can reveal the landscape below it. So here I go. I'm going to click on my brush, and once again, we have the control over that brush. We can right click, and I want to make it soft, a very soft brush, and I'm going to maybe play around with the size of it. but I'll use my keyboard for that. So what I'm going to do, and another way, I'm going to start off slow. If I do 100% and start erasing or hiding pixels, not a fan of that. I want to start off slow. So 10%, and I'm going to press enter, and I'm just going to start playing around. So I'm painting on black, so that way I'm hiding. I'll make sure my mask is selected, and I'm just going to start hiding some of that. Now, once again, it's going a little slow and I'm building up. And now you'll know in the history panel, every time I click, a new part comes up, and that's totally fine. If I want to click and drag for a while, I could do that as well. Or now if I want to change the opacity, say, you know what, I need a little bit more because I want it to go a little bit faster, or there's some parts I really want to erase, I can start doing that as well. So once again, we're just playing around. I needed that softer brush, not the harder brush. There we go. So it kind of just blends a little bit nicer. And now I'm just playing with that particular mask. Okay, and that's totally fine. This looks okay. I'm pretty happy with this. You know, maybe there's certain edges, but you know what? I do like to blend in a little bit more. Okay, so we're just playing around. Now what I can do is I can go actually back to my landscape mask and make sure the mask is selected and play around with the landscape. Start playing around with how much of the sky I want to get rid of. And kind of like that. And if you know what I was looking for in terms of this is to blend in the foreground to the background as much as you possibly can. So that's where the skies really come into play really nicely. Different plays with contrast of light and dark is really going to help you coming onto these layer masks and how they interact. So you're going to start playing around and painting away and painting on, so hiding and revealing pixels, and see how that goes. Now another way to work with this is not only playing with the mask, but playing with the blending modes of each of these as well. So let's start with the blending mode of the landscape. So let's hover over the blending modes and just see what starts to happen if I play around with these. Yeah, my picture is selected. I'm going to hover over. And not too much is happening. That one's not too bad. That one's pretty cool too. I'm going to go to darken, because what darken does actually, it kind of got rid of my background for me. What I have to do here now is click on this mask and start to delete some of these areas with a little bit less. Now I could always bring parts back that I want or not, and really even zoom in even more and get really, really close and really, really detailed. But I'm not too concerned about that right now. I'm just playing around. Obviously, you're going to play around a little bit more. However that works. The other option, I could always play around with the opacity if I want to lower the opacity of the landscape in general and see really what's going on. The portrait, I could play with the opacity a little bit, but I don't really want to play too much, but there is the option there as well. And once again, the portrait too, I could even play around with its blending mode as well and see if something starts to happen there that I want to see that works and how it blends in well together. Now, it all depends on your portrait. The portrait really is the most important part. Once you set up that portrait or find the right portrait, obviously I worked with one. I could have had a better portrait for sure. And then how the landscape overlays with that particular portrait as well. So it all depends on that. And the great thing about this, I already have everything set up. So if I want to bring in another landscape, I could and just set it inside and see which one works better. But let's pretend for now this is looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. You know, I do want to play around with this because I'm having those issues down here just to show that, okay, I'm going to add white and I'm going to bring those back. But I also have to keep in mind that I have my landscape below it too, because I'm bringing that back as well. Either way, we're playing around. We're just seeing what's happening because we're still far from done. Okay, now the next part of this is the adjustment layers. So I'm pretty happy with what's going on so far, pretty happy. I still have a lot of work to do. I can play around with this so much more. So what I want to do now is I want to take the color away. I want to mute these, desaturate these, because normally when we look at these, we see that we have muted tones and maybe splashes of color. So I'm going to do that now and see what I can get. But before I do any of that, I do want to add that gray background. I don't want that stark white background. I want a little bit of a muted tone there too. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually not going to use my background layer. I'm going to leave this alone. That's fine. I actually want to make a new layer just to show you. I'm going to click on my adjustment layer, and this time I'm going to click a solid color. And when I click on a solid color adjustment layer, it just fills the whole layer with that perfect square, and I can change it to any color I want. So I want that. I don't want that white. I don't want the black. I just want to play around with a muted gray, so a light gray, and just see, and that's pretty good. This is going to help just offset. If I do have some whites in there, they're going to pop, especially in the eye, and the gray background will just help that out. Another way, obviously, to do that is to just grab a shape layer, rectangle tool, just click and drag, and now I have that, and I can just play around with the color there too. That's another way to add in a background if you wanted to, just a shape layer, which is easy to play with too, but I'm going to throw that out. Okay, there I go. Now, adjustment layers. Two things I need to have happen. So you know what I'm going to do? These are kind of in my way. I'm just going to select both of these. Select the portrait copy, select both by holding Command or Shift, and I'm just going to group Command G or new group from layers, and now I have that. I say group 1 is fine. That's usually what it's called. And I'm just going to call these resource files because these are my resource files if I ever need to go back and use them. And I'm just going to shut them off for now. Don't need them. And I'm going to put them down here. Great. Now just remember they're underneath the background layer, so they're going to be hidden even if you do turn them on. Anyways, what I want to do now, I want to mute each one. I want to add an adjustment layer to each of these layers, and I'm going to make a clipping mask. So you're going to understand what I'm doing in just a little bit. So first I'm going to click on my landscape, and I'm going to make an adjustment layer. Oh, sorry, I clicked on mask. I'm going to choose an adjustment layer. I'm going to make hue saturation. So I'm going to bring down the saturation. Once again, your properties panel is open, and I'm going to bring down the saturation. Now you're like, well, something's happening, the saturation. You're bringing down the saturation a little bit, but it's not all coming down. The face, the portrait still has saturation. Correct. So this is how adjustment layers work. So the adjustment layer on the layer panel will only affect everything below it. It will not affect anything above it. So if I wanted this hue saturation adjustment layer to affect the portrait too, I need to bring it above the portrait. And now look, it desaturated it as well. It was affected. All these files, all these layers are affected by the saturation above it, the adjustment layer above it. If I don't want it to, I bring it down. Just click and drag it down, and now it's only affecting this layer. If I drag it down underneath, now it's only affecting these layers, which obviously isn't much right now. So I'm going to bring it up between, and I'm going to say I only wanted to adjust this layer. I can bring it up all the way. It's going to affect all the layers. But let's say I want separate control. I don't want hue saturation to control all of this because maybe I want to bring back a little bit of color to the tree. Well, if I do that, I'm also bringing back some of the color for the portrait. I don't want that. What I want is this for this adjustment layer only to affect this layer. So what I need to do, use a clipping mask. So a clipping mask allows certain layers only to affect other layers, not all the layers. So I'm going to click here, and there's a little trick on how to use this. There's a quick way, which is just right click. Make sure the layer that you want to affect is above the layer. So the adjustment layer is above the main layer I want to affect. I'm going to right click and click on create clipping mask. Awesome. Look what happened. That arrow shows me that yes, this is a clipping mask. This layer is clipped to this layer. Great. But another way to do it, I'm going to undo that. A quicker way to do it is to hold down Option or Alt on a PC. And I'm going to not click. I'm just going to hover over between the two layers. And look what happens. A cursor shows up. Has a square and a little arrow pointing down. That's the clipping mask. So as soon as I press click now I have that clipping mask set up again. I'm going to do that one more time. So this time I want an adjustment layer, the exact same one. I'm going to duplicate it for the landscape layer. So you're going to have two clipping masks at least. I'm going to click and drag, hold down Option or Alt on a PC, and I click it and I drag it. The blue line's there, and it shows me where it's going to go. Great. Now I want to clip this adjustment layer to this landscape layer. Not a problem. I'm going to hold down Option. I'm not going to click on my mouse yet. I'm just going to hover over between the two layers, and then I'm going to click once that cursor shows up. Once it shows up, I click, and now it's clipped there. Now the reason why we do this, once again, if I click on this adjustment layer that's affecting the landscape, I can actually play around with it individually. I could say, yes, I want a little bit more saturation, a little less, I want it lighter, I want it darker, whatever the case is. Okay, so now I have that one there, and if I want to play around with just this one, that affects this layer, I could say, yes, once again, I want to bring this up a little bit, a little less. So now I have control over both of those. Now look what else that happened in the adjustment layer. Look at this, it's a mask. So if I actually played around with this, let's pretend I made it a totally separate color, the forest is green. If I click on this mask and paint black, because it's white, I'm going to actually remove parts of that adjustment layer that I don't want. Let's make it 100%. I'm going to actually remove and bring back some of that color from underneath. And so now I have that mask there. Now, once again, if I don't want those things to happen, I could obviously just paint white and bring it all back. Or I wouldn't delete the mask. I would just work with that mask a little bit more and add all the white back that I needed. And there's still a little there, but that's okay. It can't be seen anyways. Okay, good. So that's what I want to see with clipping masks and adjustment layers. Now remember, we're in RGB right now. We're playing in RGB mode, image mode, RGB. If I were to convert this to CMYK, these will probably disappear. And that's not good. We don't want these to disappear. That's why we work in RGB. So we actually have access to hue saturation, and if we convert to CMYK, they'll disappear. Then we revert back to RGB, and we're still good. So that's how the adjustment layers work. Now I'm going to do one more thing here. Is now that my tones are muted, and I brought them back down, and this is back down to 0. I'm going to add in my own splashes of color. I'm going to add in my own little special areas of color that I want to work with. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring in a gradient layer. So where I'm going to start, because any layer you click on, that adjustment layer is going to go above it. So let me start up here. So I'm going to click on that top layer. I'm going to click here on the adjustment layer, and I'm going to make a gradient fill layer. So here's my gradient fill. Beautiful. Now, it just made it automatically black to transparent, which is what I don't want. So I'm going to click on the gradient area here, and I'm going to make my own gradient. So I'm going to click on this stop right here at the bottom, and I'm going to choose a very vibrant color. So usually I like to go like a very orangey, something very bright, just to play around. I'll say, okay. What I'm also going to do with this stop, instead, because right now it's going from this color actually to a black to a transparent, because this is black. I'm going to click on that stop, and I'm going to try to pick a color very similar to it, or click that exact color. My eyedropper, once I hover over the artboard, it chooses that color again. Perfect. So it obviously did change it. Now understand that this is black. So this actually isn't black. It's just showing you the top ones are the opacities. The bottom ones are the colors. So the top one right here is at 100%. I could bring it down if I wanted to, but I don't want to. I'm just showing you that. And this one, once again, is at 0%. So 0% opacity, that means it's going to transparent. If I wanted to bring it up, I can, but obviously I don't want that either. So there we go. So I'll say, okay, happy with that. Now I'm going to make it radial because I want it to kind of be like a spot, like a little splash of color. And I'm going to bring up the scale a little bit, maybe to 130. And what that does, it makes the gradient grow bigger or smaller. So right now I just want it at a decent size right there. Make it a little bit bigger. That's fine. And I'm going to shut off, and I could actually reverse it if I want to reverse it, but I don't want to do that. I could actually shut off align with layer, because what I can do now, if I shut that off, I'm able actually to move it around. I can't do it just yet, but I'm just going to say, okay. And now if I click back on the gradient again, just the gradient part, not the mask, the gradient part, I'll double click. I can actually now move it around the canvas anywhere I want. So it's like this little spotlight that moves around, but I'm not done yet. It kind of looks weird right now at the moment, but what I want to do, I'm going to play around with the blending mode and see how it blends. This is going to blend with this layer and this layer. So let's see how that works. I'm just going to hover over and see what works best for me. And once again, this is pretty cool, but remember, it has a mask. If I really like this, but I don't love the way that it interacts with the background, I can mask out the background. But let me continue working with it and see how that works. That one works really nice. Okay, give you a bunch of different great options for how the blending modes work. So color is kind of nice. I saw a few nice ones up here. Even this one's really good because this one doesn't change the background at all. It only interferes or blends with the pixels that are showing, which is really, really nice. So if I'm like, oh, it's good, but I want it to be a little bit more intense, duplicate it. Command J. Now it's even more intense. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on this again. I'm just going to reposition it maybe up here a little bit. Looks good. And what I'll do is I'll duplicate it. If I want it a little bit more intense, that's fine if I wanted to. Another option, I'm going to get rid of that. Another option is actually to make it a clipping mask. So if I were to clip this to this area, it won't clip to this adjustment layer. It clips to the portrait. So you can't have a clip inside a clip inside a clip. That's not going to work. So if I were to hover over, hold on Option and click, now it's only affecting this layer, which I kind of like, kind of don't like. I kind of like that effect that it kind of played around with the whole area here. And once again, if I wanted to bring it down here, I could, and it affects everything. Okay, so either way, I like it over there, great. But what I am going to do now is I'm going to duplicate it again, and this time I'm going to change the color. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to click on the gradient bar, and I'm going to click on the other stop, and I'm just going to pick a new color. Doesn't matter what color, just playing around. I'll say okay. Great, but the brighter, the more saturated, the more vibrant the color, the better off it is. I'll say okay, and I'll say okay, and once again I'll click on it again and I'll move it around. Maybe I'll move it down here. Okay, nice. Now once again, we're just playing around. If I want to grow it out a little bit, as like I want it to be a little bit stronger, cool, I can do that. Okay, awesome. Once again, if I want to clip it, like say just to the clipping mask, the landscape, sorry, down here, I'll clip it. And it's just affecting this layer. And that's how clipping masks work. So I am going to bring it up to the top, play around, and maybe I want to play with a different blending mode, which is totally fine. I kind of like what's going on there. Great. Now I do notice that this particular one, this gradient fill, is affecting the background a little bit. I see a little bit of that halo there. That's okay. I can click on my mask, and I can always refine any mask I want anytime. So I'm going to click on the brush tool. I'll click on black to erase some of this, and I'm just going to start erasing. And what I'll probably do is, no, that's fine. I actually kind of like what's going on there. I do have to be careful up here because I don't want it to have leave such a hard edge. So what I'll do maybe is maybe I'll grow this out a little bit, and I'll bring this down to 25. I always do that. And I'll just kind of slowly erase part of that. And if I can make my brush smaller, that's how you could really control this. I'm just playing around, having some fun with it. You could add more of these, but what I at least need to see, are you playing with layer masks? So portrait layer has to have a layer mask, and the landscape has to have a layer mask. You have to have two separate adjustment layers of hue saturation, and they both have to be clipped to each portrait and landscape. You have to have shown me that you've made a couple gradient layers that will interact with it in a certain way, and that your background is still not really affected too much by these as either, okay? So different blending modes will help you in a different way. Okay, now that we've done that, and keep in mind, once again, I know I duplicated this the one time. I could also bring down the opacity of that too. It's like I just want a little bit of that color in there, and same with this one. If I just want a little bit of that tone in there. Now the next thing I want to show you is a little bit of an extra piece. So before I bring the type in and start actually creating more of a layout, more of a composition, I want to show you that you're actually able to make more exposures on here. So I'm going to open up my double exposure, and this time I'm going to open up another landscape. I'm going to bring in this mountain here. I'm going to click and drag, bring it into Photoshop, and it's going to open up. And once again, I'm just going to just click and drag, bring it over top, and now here it is. And look, it clipped there automatically because I had this selected. It'll actually clip as well, which I don't really want. So I'm just going to click and drag it out, and it won't be clipped anymore. It's on its own. Now this is fine, this is okay. Now remember, I saved that mask I had before. So because that mask was perfect, I was really happy with it. I'm gonna hold on Option or Alt on a PC, click and drag over top of the landscape, and now I have that perfectly set up in there. And I can move that landscape anytime I want, move it in here anyway, and that looks good. I can size it up a little bit more and start playing around with that landscape. Now let's say I wanna bring that landscape and I wanna bring that actually up above the other landscape and have it on top of it. Okay, so what do I do now? Play around with the mask. So I'm going to add some black. Let's go 50%, and I'm just going to start erasing, and there I go. So I have that little bit of a mountain there, which kind of blends in a little bit, but I have this cool road part that's showing there. So it all depends on the landscape you have, how you want to play with it, how it works, how it doesn't, and maybe there's a better way to work with it. it, maybe not. Okay, so I have a bit of trees there, I have the mountain here, I have this. Now, some of it's kind of hard to tell what's going on, and that's okay. But it's kind of fun, but it's good to know that, okay, there's trees here, there's a road here, there's a mountain. Pretty cool. And once again, I can always play around with some of these other features. Again, I kind of want to get rid of that, but I want to keep the jawline in there a little bit, so I could do that too. But it all depends on which images you're using. If I want to go back and clean up these images, these masks, what I would probably have to do is really refine my first mask, and then the other ones I'd have to fix up too. So it's good to have a really good mask at the beginning and then play around. But generally it was pretty good. But I am going to clean it up really quickly just to show you. Then I'll have to do it for this mask too. And I'll have to do it for this mask too. I could even get rid of that if I wanted to. Clean up this part for this mask. Clean up this for this mask. And click on the other mask too. Okay, I actually kind of like that. It's a little fuzzy there. And what I could also do is do the opposite. So I don't want to bring it back too much. I should have fixed that up when I first had it, but that's okay. Not a problem. I could always just mask that totally out if I wanted to. And there I go. So that's kind of looking interesting. Great. So now what I want to do, I'm going to select everything here. So I'm going to hold down, click on the top layer, click on the bottom layer. That's all a part of the double exposure. And I held down shift. So hold down there, hold down shift, click the bottom layer, Command G or Control G on a PC, or just go to new group from layers and you've grouped it all together. I'm going to call this properly is DE for double exposure. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my type in. So I'm just going to click on my type tool. There I go. I'm going to click and I'm just going to type in anything. Now for this particular assignment, looking for name of a band, name of the album. I already have a Gotham set up, which I love Gotham. It's really, really small. So with that, what happened automatically when I clicked on my type tool, the properties panel opens up and I could actually make my type bigger here. Or, I didn't select it all. I could double click here and select it, or Command A and select it all and make my type a little bit bigger here. That's fine. Or I can go to my character panel and do the same thing because the properties panel is just a quicker way to do it. Or with my move tool selected, I could once again Command T and do it that way. So I could size it up. Remember, don't squeeze it. Make sure you scale proportionally. So I love the Verve, and so I'm just going to put this and pretend I'm making an album cover for them. I'm going to bring it down, play around. Remember, it's on top of everything. If I want it to be below, it would be below. But if I don't want it to actually be below that, I just want it maybe over there or something like that. That could be interesting. But for now, I don't really want that. It does look pretty cool, but I do want it above everything. So what I can do now, and you could, of course, make it work any way you want. You could put it in there, but as long as your layers are organized, I'm very, very happy. So the Verve, and then I'm just going to duplicate this. I could duplicate it here or on the artboard. Hold on Option, hold down Shift, bring it down, and I'm just going to just call something silly. Some silly words. Once again, you're just going to be fictional. You're just going to be real. I really don't care. We're just playing around, having some fun. A real band or a fake band or musician or anything you want. Okay. So now I've played with that. This is kind of the cover. Now, one of the things I want you to do is make another clipping mask, but clipping masks for the type. What I'll quickly do is select both of these layers, hold down Command and click, Command G, group it, and I'm just going to call this type. So I know I have my resource layer, which I could have used. I could have put that inside. Actually, I could have put that inside my double exposure too, because it's a part of the double exposure. Just click and drag. I put it at drag it to the bottom, and now it's a part of the double exposure layer. So now it's all contained in there. So let me do that one more time just to show. If I click and drag it directly onto a closed group layer, it's going to go right to the top of that layer. Actually, it's right there. However, if I open up my layer that I want to put it in, I just click and drag and just put it to the bottom, it goes into the bottom of that big grouped layer, which is kind of what I want. There I go. So with my type layer, I'm going to open it up, and here's what I'm going to play with. So what I want to do is I want to put a picture inside of the type. Very, very simple. It's a clipping mask. That's all it is. So an easy way to do it, you could bring in another picture and play around with it in there. Totally cool, but not necessary. A quick way to do it is to actually merge these layers, merge all these layers, and take this picture and put that picture inside of the type. So I'm just going to do that really quickly. Now, this could be a little bit of trouble because if you merge this in such a way, it'll flatten out the whole layer and you've lost the whole folder and you've lost everything. So make sure you Command, Option, and E. Command, Option, E, or Control, Option, E on a PC will not only merge the layer and flatten it for you, but it will also keep all your files here. Let's do the opposite. If I just did Command E, I flatten everything, but I also lose all my editable original layers. I don't want that. Command Z, going to undo that. So again, Command, Option, E, and now I've merged everything flattened, but I've also kept my original layers. So what I'm going to do here, now I'm going to click and drag this layer, this merged layer, and I'm going to put it on top. And now it just looks like I just got rid of the type, but I didn't. The type's still there, but now this merged layer, it's here. I'm going to make a clipping mask. But I'm going to do it for the verb, just the album, or sorry, the name of the band first. I'm going to hover over between the two layers, hold on Option, and click. I made a clipping mask. So now this picture is inside of this type. Now you're still thinking, hey, wait a second, I still can't see it. Yes, you can. You just have to move this layer. So I'm going to move it, and now I start to see that, yes, it is in there. I can see that. Pretty cool. I kind of like what's happening there, but once again, like I said, you could bring in your own image, you could do something else. As long as it's clipped inside to that, I'm happy. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to duplicate this again. I'm going to hold on Option, click and drag, bring it down. You see my cursor turned into a double arrow, meaning it's duplicating something. I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to clip it to the other word. All in all, I'm going to hover, holding down Option between the two layers, click, and now it's merged to that. Clipped to that one. And once again, I can move it around and pick another part of the area I like. And once again, I can play around with the blending mode, see if it does something a little bit different, which it's going to be a little bit trickier here, but there is an option for it to kind of play around. Actually, maybe that one kind of works. And let's see if I can move it and try to get a little bit more contrast. That's not too bad. I like that too. Cool. So this potentially is my album cover. Done. Happy. Once again, I would probably clean this up a little bit more. Some things I could always go back and play around with the mask. That's the great thing about this. I can go back and play around with all of it, which I'm going to show you just a little bit more. So another extra thing we can do. I know I see a lot of this too. I see these kind of birds that people always have these birds flying around sometimes, kind of the trees. It kind of makes sense. So I'm just going to click and drag and bring that in. So there's a little extra thing you could do as well. And I'm going to bring those in, click and drag, bring it over top. And like I did before, I'm going to my properties panel, and I want to make sure that this is inside my double exposure, maybe just above the landscape, or maybe actually bring it right above the portrait. And I'm just going to select remove background actually, and just keep those birds. Great. And it kind of already starting to take shape in this regard. So I'm just going to click and drag, maybe Command T, free transform them, and just play around with how I want that to look. So looking good, happy with that. Now what I want to do is an important part. I want to save it for print because it's prepared for print, and I want to save it for the web. So I know that right now it's RGB, which is great. Oh, and I should save it properly. My apologies. You should save often, of course, but here I'm going to Command S. Sorry, I'll just go to File, Save. And I'm going to save it in a nice folder here, which I already have here. I'm going to zoom out. Go back. And I'm going to make a new folder called PSD because this is my native file. And I'm just going to name this properly as I normally do. Call it double exposure. Okay, there we go. And save it. Now I have my proper PSD saved, so I'm always good. Now, once again, it's RGB, which is good, which is what I want. But right now, what do I save first? Okay, I need to save it for print. So that means it needs to be 300 pixels per inch and it needs to be CMYK. Great, that's good. Now, I only have one of those. So if I went to image and image size, I know for a fact this is 300 pixels per inch. This is great because every time I brought an image in to this canvas here, to this artboard, what would happen is it would automatically be converted to 300 pixels per inch. That's great. So that's an interesting thing to know. So anything, even if this image was super small or super big, doesn't matter. No matter what, as soon as I brought it into this document, it becomes 300 pixels per inch and it becomes RGB automatically. The opposite, if this was CMYK, a document, it would automatically become CMYK. So now I have everything set up. I know it's 300 pixels per inch. I'm going to save this for print first. So I can go to File, I can go to Image, and now watch what happens here. I'm going to go to Image, I'm going to go to Mode, and CMYK. And I say, are you sure you want to change everything? I do not want to flatten. You do not want to flatten. You just want to say OK. Because if you flatten everything, all your layers will disappear. Not that that's a bad thing, because you could always undo, but I'm just going to say OK. Let's see what happens. Whoa, not cool. I just lost a bunch of my adjustment layers. Look what happened. My hue and saturation layers are gone. Not good. Because remember, we converted the CMYK, so therefore those adjustment layers will disappear because they're not a part of CMYK. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to go back. Okay, good. My main aesthetic is here. It's still there. Great. So what I can do instead, because I don't want that to happen, I don't want this adjustment layers to disappear, that's a big part of my assignment. And other things obviously happen there too with colors. Not cool. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select everything and I'm going to merge them again. But I'm going to do Command Option E. So what happens there, when I do Command Option E, I merge everything, but I get to keep all my editable layers and keep my adjustment layers as well. Great. So now that I have that, it's merged. Now let me convert to CMYK. Image Mode, CMYK, and now nothing should change because this is a flattened version of this color. Great. Nothing changed. I'm in CMYK. But notice that once again, my adjustment layers are gone, but this layer was flattened, so it totally worked out. It's fine. If I shut this off, clearly you're going to see that issue we had. But that's okay because we're not done yet. Just make sure not to save and close this just yet. So here I've merged it. Great. It's CMYK. It's 300 pixels per inch. Let's save it as a TIFF. So I'm going to go to File. I'm going to show you two different ways. So File and Save As, which is a common thing to do. And I'm just going to go inside of my organized folder and I'm going to click on links because this would be a link, but in a sense it's also the final part, but I'm just going to say let's just say final because this actually is the final. Normally if I was save it as a link because I'm going to link it to InDesign, I would do that. I'm just going to say final. I'm going to create, there it is, and I'm just going to convert this to a TIFF and I'll say format TIFF. Well, there actually is an issue here. I'm going to click on TIFF, but watch what happens. I'm going to say save. Look, discard layers and save a copy is not active. This is somewhat of a new thing in Photoshop. Not cool. I'm not a fan of it. However, that's okay. We don't want this. What we want to do instead is File, Save As, and what Photoshop is kind of forcing us to do, which is kind of cool but not great, is it's saying no, save a copy. That way you'll have more option as a TIFF to discard the layer. So I'm going to go to Photoshop. Now it's saved a copy, which I assume it's going to say copy here, which you can get rid of. And I'm going to say TIFF. Great. Save. Now I have the option to discard layers and save a copy. Remember, we don't need the layers on a TIFF because the layers are on the PSD file. If I ever want to go back and edit them, I go to the Photoshop file. If I were to save my layers on a TIFF, the TIFF would be huge in file size and not necessary to have all those layers. So make sure image compression is none. You didn't have a transparency, so Photoshop recognizes that, so you don't have to save as a transparency. And discard layers and save a copy. Okay, done. That part is done. Now, this is an important part right now. Do not go back and mode and switch it back to RGB because you're still going to lose all those adjustments. Those adjustment layers aren't there. You want to bring them back. So what I'll do is I could either go back, Command Z, or just go to my history panel and just go back from when I converted it to CMYK, which is one back. Now look what happens. My adjustment layers came back, all my colors are good, everything's the exact same, beautiful. This is where I want to be right now. So remember, it's back to RGB, image mode, it's back to RGB, my adjustment layers and everything is there, everything's been saved, beautiful. Now what I want to do, I want to save it for the web. Let's take a look at how we save for the web. Okay, so I have this, I could turn this one back on or off, it doesn't matter. And now I'm going to save for web. I'm going to go to File, Export, and save for web. So that's Command Option Shift S, which you might want to remember that one. That's a really good one. Sorry, I went too far. That was a little too quick. What I need to do first is convert it from 300 pixels to 72 pixels, and that's image size. So I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to click on resample. This is the time we click on resample, is when we want to bring all those pixels down to 72 pixels per inch, and watch what happens. As I click on that, my actual pixel density will change, not the size here, okay? So I'm going to click on that and say okay. Great. Now you'll know you did the right thing is if your image goes really small, and that's a good thing. I can zoom in, that's fine. I'm at, right now, my left corner says I'm at 33%. So at 100%, this is what it looks like. Great. That's beautiful. Now I'm going to save it properly. So now if I look, once again, image mode is RGB and the image size is 72 pixels per inch. Ready for the web. Beautiful. Good. So I'm just going to cancel that. I'm going to go to File, Export, Save for Web. Great. Now this is what shows up. A new panel shows up, and I have a few options here. I could just look at the original. I could look at the optimized version, which is what I'm about to do. I'm going to optimize it. Or I could look at 2-up or 4-up. Now I prefer 2-up because I'm only going to do really one change here. There's some manual tools on the side which we really don't use. I'm just going to focus here. So now I said you could save it as a JPEG or a PNG. You could save things for the web as a GIF, JPEG, PNG8, PNG24, or a web bitmap. Now for this, I'm just going to say JPEG. I don't have a transparent background, so I don't really need to save it as a PNG. But if you like saving things as PNGs, that's totally fine. I'll totally accept that. Quality, 100%. All these other things I really don't have to worry about. This is a way to save file size. But right now I know that my original image is 2.27 megabytes, but already because I converted it to a JPEG, it's going to be 420 kilobytes, which is super tiny and it'll load really, really fast. I see that my image size is 891 by 891 in terms of its pixels. Its pixel density, great, totally fine. That's it. This is all you really have to do. Let's pretend I do want to save it as a PNG, PNG24, best quality PNG. I'm going to click OK. And now from 400 or so, it went to 666. So a bit of a difference, a little bit bigger file size, but the quality is really, really good. If we zoom in really close, you're going to see that the bit of a difference, that there's a little less quality here, a little bit better here. Let's go to JPEG and see what that does. Very similar, not a huge difference, but PNGs usually have a little bit better quality, but either way, we're good here. I'm going to say save. And I'm going to put it in my proper folder under final. And this is my JPEG. I'm just going to say save. It's properly named. Okay, good. Now I'm not done yet. Don't save and close it just yet. Go back one more. Okay, so now where I should leave my PSD as an RGB, and it should be 300 pixels per inch. This is what I want to see, because I leave it in RGB because I could access all the great things that CMYK has to offer, and I didn't lose any of my original adjustments or colors. Great. I also leave it at 300 pixels per inch because this is the best quality I want it to be, just in case I have to make some changes and I still need it to go to print. This way I can actually go back and make those changes and it's still good for print. If I accidentally save this at 72 pixels per inch and RGB, it'd be tiny, it'd be small. I'd open it back up and get something ready for print. It's not gonna work. I'd have to reconstruct this whole thing again. So be sure, save your TIFFs as CMYK 300 pixels per inch. Revert back to your original RGB so you don't lose anything, and then change your image size to 72 pixels per inch. Save it for web. Before you close it, revert back again to 300 pixels per inch, and then you could save it as an RGB 300 pixels per inch, and now you're good to go. So I hope that helped. I hope that worked out for you, and you could definitely play around so much with this double exposure. Bring in extra exposures if you want, not necessary, and really have some fun with it and see where that takes you.